The HOA president thought she was so smart when she banned my daughter from visiting me. "No more unauthorized personnel in this community," she announced to the whole neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that my daughter had just discovered something that would destroy their entire board and cost every single homeowner $5,000 in emergency repairs. You see, while Margaret was busy fining me for tomato plants and yelling about property values, my daughter, who happens to be a federal engineer, had noticed that our $1 million drainage system was completely illegal and had been poisoning the local watershed for 20 years. Sometimes karma wears a hard hat and carries federal enforcement powers. I didn't say a word when Margaret Hendricks, our HOA president, stood in my driveway screaming about unauthorized personnel conducting illegal surveys on association property. I just handed her the federal inspection order stamped with the Army Corps of Engineers seal and watched her face drain of color as she read the words. Critical infrastructure assessment, mandatory compliance required. Her lawyer, who'd been so confident 5 minutes earlier, suddenly found his shoes very interesting. 2 years ago, none of this would have mattered to me. I'd moved to Pine Valley Estates after retiring from 37 years as a high school history teacher, looking forward to nothing more complicated than tending my vegetable garden and reading on the back porch. The house was perfect, a modest ranch on a corner lot with mature oak trees and enough space for the grandkids to run around when they visited. The neighborhood seemed quiet, established, the kind of place where people minded their own business and took care of their properties without drama. I wasn't looking for trouble or trying to make waves. After decades of dealing with teenage attitudes and administrative bureaucracy, all I wanted was peace. My late wife Sarah had always talked about having a little garden where she could grow tomatoes and maybe some flowers. And even though she'd passed before we could make that dream happen, I figured I'd do it for both of us. The HOA seemed like a minor inconvenience at worst, a small monthly fee to keep the common areas maintained and ensure property values stayed stable. I'd never been to a board meeting, never read the bylaws beyond the basic summary they'd given me at closing. Why would I? I was just planning to live quietly and bother no one. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, taped to my front door with enough adhesive to remove paint. Violation notice, unauthorized landscaping modifications was printed in bold red letters across the top. According to the notice, my raised garden beds were non-compliant structures requiring Architectural Review Board approval and constituted a visual obstruction inconsistent with community standards. I was being fined $50 per day until the structures were removed and the yard returned to approved landscaping specifications. I stared at the letter for a good 5 minutes, trying to process what I was reading. These weren't permanent structures. They were simple wooden boxes I'd built myself, maybe 18 inches high, filled with good soil where I could grow vegetables without having to bend over so much. They were neat, well constructed, and positioned in my backyard where they were barely visible from the street. But apparently, according to Section 4.7b of the Community Guidelines, any structure over 12 inches in height required written approval, and any food gardening had to be conducted in discrete containers, not exceeding 10 square feet in total area. I drove over to the HOA office that afternoon, thinking this had to be some kind of mistake. Surely reasonable people could work this out with a simple conversation. Margaret Hendricks was waiting for me like she'd been expecting the visit, her arms crossed and her expression suggesting I'd personally insulted her family. When I explained that I was just trying to grow some tomatoes and hadn't realized I needed permission, she launched into a 15-minute lecture about property values, community standards, and the importance of maintaining uniformity. Rules. Our rules, Mr. Peterson, she kept saying. We can't make exceptions, or everyone will want to do whatever they please. I tried suggesting compromises. Maybe I could move the beds, or build them lower, or plant some decorative flowers around them. But Margaret wasn't interested in solutions. She wanted compliance, which meant complete removal. When I mentioned that I'd already planted seeds and it seemed wasteful to destroy healthy plants, she actually rolled her eyes. "You should have thought about that before you built illegal structures," she said, tapping her pen against the desk like she was dealing with a particularly slow child. That night, I sat down and actually read through the HOA covenants and bylaws for the first time. What I found was disturbing. The document was 47 pages of microscopic print, covering everything from approved mailbox styles to the exact shade of beige allowed for exterior paint. Residents couldn't hang laundry outside, couldn't park RVs or boats in their own driveways for more than 24 hours, couldn't install solar panels without a 2-month approval process, and couldn't plant anything except from a pre-approved list of appropriate vegetation. The fines were substantial and compounding, $50 per day for most violations, escalating to $100 per day after 30 days of non-compliance. But what really caught my attention was a section buried deep in the architectural guidelines about drainage and water management. The HOA maintained strict control over any modifications that might affect community water flow patterns or impact the engineered drainage systems that served the development. Any resident who wanted to install French drains, modify their lot grading, or even build a deck had to submit detailed plans showing how their project would interact with the neighborhood's water management infrastructure. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. During the next heavy rain, I watched how water moved through our neighborhood, and something didn't look right. The storm drains were backing up, creating standing water in several yards, and the retention pond at the community center was obviously struggling to handle the volume. But when I mentioned this at the next board meeting, my first and what I assumed would be my last, Margaret dismissed my concerns immediately. "Our drainage system was professionally designed and installed," she said. "If individual homeowners would stop making unauthorized modifications to their lots, we wouldn't have any problems." The violations kept coming. Apparently, my garden beds were just the beginning. Next, they cited me for unauthorized exterior lighting because I'd installed a motion sensor light by my back door for security. Then it was non-conforming window treatments because my bedroom curtains were visible from the street and weren't the approved neutral colors. Each violation came with its own $50 daily fine, and the letters grew increasingly threatening. By June, I was facing over $4,000 in accumulated penalties, with new violations appearing faster than I could address the old ones. My daughter Jennifer came to visit that month, and I mentioned the HOA troubles over dinner more as a source of dark humor than a real problem. But Jennifer didn't laugh. As a civil engineer with the Army Corps of Engineers, she'd dealt with poorly designed drainage systems before, and when I described what I'd observed during storms, her professional instincts kicked in. "Dad, that sounds like they've got serious infrastructure problems," she said. "If their retention system is failing and they're blaming individual homeowners, that's usually a sign that the original design was inadequate or the installation was botched." She offered to take a look around the neighborhood the next morning, just to satisfy her curiosity. Jennifer had always been methodical, even as a kid, the type who read instruction manuals cover to cover and organized her toys by color and size. Now, she walked through Pine Valley Estates with the same systematic approach, taking photos, making notes, and asking technical questions I couldn't answer. When she knelt down to examine one of the storm drains, Margaret Hendricks appeared, as if summoned by some kind of property management radar. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Margaret demanded, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for people she considered beneath her authority. Jennifer stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her hands, and explained that she was just looking at the drainage system because she'd noticed some potential issues. But Margaret wasn't interested in credentials or professional expertise. "I don't care what you think you know," she snapped. "You have no authority here, and I'm ordering you to stop this unauthorized survey immediately." That's when things got interesting. Jennifer tried to explain that she wasn't conducting an official survey, just observing public infrastructure as a concerned citizen and professional engineer. But Margaret had already decided this was some kind of challenge to her authority. "You're trespassing on association property," she announced loudly enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "I'm calling the police, and I'm issuing a formal ban on you entering this community. Your father can receive his mail and conduct his business here, but you are no longer welcome." I watched this confrontation from my front porch, feeling something shift inside me that I hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder and more focused. Margaret was using her petty authority to humiliate my family, turning what should have been a simple conversation into a public spectacle designed to demonstrate her power. But what she didn't understand was that she'd just made a serious tactical error. Jennifer called me that evening from her hotel. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I saw today, and I need to tell you something," she said. "Your HOA's drainage system isn't just poorly designed, it's potentially dangerous. Those retention ponds aren't sized correctly for your watershed area. The storm drains are undersized, and from what I could see, they've got serious grading problems that are directing runoff toward residential foundations instead of proper outlets." She explained that under federal regulations, any residential development that affected natural drainage patterns or relied on engineered water management systems had to meet specific Army Corps of Engineers standards. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were mandatory requirements with serious legal consequences for non-compliance. If they built this place without proper permits, or if they're operating a deficient system that could cause flooding or property damage, they're in violation of federal law, she said. And Dad, based on what I saw, I think they know it. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of all the permits and engineering reports filed for Pine Valley Estates. What I found was fascinating. The original drainage plan had been approved in 1987, but it had been modified 3 times since then, always to reduce costs and simplify construction. The retention ponds had been made smaller, the storm drains had been downsized, and the grading specifications had been altered to require less earthwork. Each modification had been approved by the county, but none of them had been reviewed by the Army Corps of Engineers, as required for projects affecting wetland areas and natural water flow. I spent the next 2 weeks in archives, libraries, and government offices, learning more about water management law than I'd ever wanted to know. But the more I researched, the clearer the picture became. Pine Valley Estates had been built on what was originally wetland, adjacent to a federally protected watershed. The developers had obtained the necessary federal permits, but the system they'd actually installed didn't match the approved plans. For nearly 20 years, they'd been operating an illegal drainage system that was gradually failing, and instead of fixing the problem, the HOA had been blaming individual homeowners for unauthorized modifications that supposedly disrupted their perfect design. Armed with this information, I made a phone call to Jennifer's office. I explained what I'd discovered and asked if there was any way the Army Corps of Engineers might be interested in conducting an inspection of our community's water management system. "Dad, if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just an inspection issue," she said. "This is a compliance enforcement matter. I'll need to file a formal report, and there will have to be an official investigation." The federal inspection notice arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning. It was addressed to the HOA board and copied to all residents, informing us that the Army Corps of Engineers had received a complaint regarding potential violations of the Clean Water Act and would be conducting a mandatory compliance inspection of all drainage infrastructure within Pine Valley Estates. The inspection would be led by Senior Civil Engineer Jennifer Peterson, and the HOA was required to provide full access to all relevant documentation, including original permits, engineering reports, modification records, and maintenance logs. I was sitting on my front porch reading the newspaper when Margaret Hendricks came storming up my driveway at 8 o'clock on Friday morning, waving a copy of the inspection notice and practically vibrating with rage. "You did this?" she screamed. "You called in some kind of fake federal inspection because you're mad about your stupid garden boxes." I let her vent for about 5 minutes, then quietly mentioned that Senior Engineer Peterson happened to be my daughter, the same daughter Margaret had banned from the community just 3 weeks earlier. The silence that followed was beautiful. Margaret's face went through several interesting color changes as the implications sank in. Her lawyer, who'd been standing behind her looking ready to cite noise ordinances and harassment policies, suddenly found his shoes fascinating. I stood up slowly, walked into my house, and returned with a folder containing copies of all the permits, engineering reports, and federal regulations I'd spent 2 weeks collecting. "Here's the thing, Margaret," I said quietly. "My daughter isn't conducting some personal vendetta. She's doing her job, which is enforcing federal water management law. And based on these documents, your drainage system has been in violation of the Clean Water Act for about 15 years. The fines for that kind of violation start at $10,000 per day, and they can shut down the entire community until compliance is achieved." I handed her the folder and watched as she flipped through pages of highlighted violations and regulatory citations. "But here's what's really interesting," I continued. "According to Section 12.4 of our HOA covenants, the board is personally liable for any legal violations that result from their management decisions. So when the Army Corps of Engineers finishes their investigation and finds that you've been operating an illegal drainage system while blaming homeowners for problems you created, you and the other board members will be individually responsible for any fines or remediation costs." Margaret's lawyer finally looked up from his shoes. "Mr. Peterson, I think there might be some room for negotiation here," he started, but I held up my hand. "Oh, we're way past negotiations," I said. "See, you made this personal when you humiliated my family and banned my daughter from the community for doing her job. So now, this isn't about my garden beds or your petty power games. This is about 20 years of federal law violations, and my daughter is very good at her job." The Army Corps inspection took 3 days and involved soil samples, water flow measurements, structural assessments, and a complete review of all documentation. Jennifer was thoroughly professional throughout, treating it exactly like any other compliance investigation. But I couldn't help noticing how Margaret and the other board members seemed to shrink a little more each day as the scope of their problems became clear. The final report was damning. The drainage system was not only inadequate for the community's needs, but it was actively contributing to erosion problems in the protected watershed downstream. The retention ponds were failing. The storm drains were backing up because they'd been undersized, and the modified grading was directing contaminated runoff toward sensitive environmental areas. The total cost of bringing the system into compliance was estimated at $1.2 million, and until the work was completed, no new construction or major landscaping could be approved anywhere in the community. Margaret Hendricks resigned from the HOA board the day after the report was released. 3 other board members followed within the week. The special assessment to pay for the drainage system repairs was spread across all 247 homes in the community, working out to about $5,000 per household, ironically, just a little more than the fines they'd tried to collect from me for my garden beds. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency meeting after the old one disappeared, took a remarkably different approach to community management. Suddenly, reasonable modifications like garden beds and security lights were perfectly acceptable as long as they didn't interfere with drainage. The architectural review process was streamlined, the daily fines were eliminated in favor of reasonable compliance periods, and the 47 pages of regulations were condensed to about 12 pages of common sense guidelines. I kept my garden beds, which are producing beautiful tomatoes this summer. Jennifer visits regularly now, usually stopping by to check on the drainage improvements and make sure everything is functioning properly. The community is quieter than it's been in years, partly because people aren't constantly fighting over petty violations, and partly because former board members tend to avoid eye contact when they see me at the mailbox. Last week, Margaret Hendricks put her house up for sale. I waved when I saw her loading boxes into her car, and she actually waved back. Not enthusiastically, but it was progress. Either way, Pine Valley Estates is peaceful again, and my tomatoes have never looked better.